Sir, that old man, he's not qualified to touch an M1 Abrams engine. The sentence cut through the air, cold and sharp, the moment the elderly man limped into the hangar where the Abrams lay motionless, like a steel body that had stopped breathing. 3 young engineers stood around it, sweat gathering at their collars, and at their feet were stacks of error reports no one had managed to solve. The harsh white lights spilled downward, exposing every trace of frustration on their faces. Elias Ward, the 67-year-old veteran, did not respond. He simply set his old toolbox on the floor, the dry clang of metal freezing the entire room for a heartbeat. Another engineer added, voice thick with disdain. "This vehicle is worth $30 million. We can't risk handing it to some antique." Ward looked at them for the briefest moment, his eyes tired yet sharp as a blade. Then he placed his hand on the side of the Abrams, slow, steady, and that single touch silenced everyone around him. A young officer muttered, "Why would General Archer call him here?" No one had time to answer, because right then, the steel door behind them swung open. The footsteps of military police echoed across the concrete, each beat forcing the engineers to straighten their backs. Then the command voice rang out, clear, firm, undeniable. "Make way for General Archer." The air shifted instantly, and in the center of all that tension, Ward remained standing beside the Abrams, steady and quiet, like a man confronting a destiny that had been taken from him decades ago. If you believe true courage is not found in gunfire but in the silence carried by those who walked through war, then subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and help us honor the memories, dignity, and quiet heroism of the veterans who should never be forgotten. Elias Ward stood still beside the lifeless Abrams, and the silence settled over him like a layer of dust from a past that had never been swept away. The tank lay there cold, heavy like a steel grave opened right before the man who once understood the heartbeat of machines better than anyone else. The warm yellow light from the overhead fixtures fell across his hand, where old scars surfaced clearly, each one a memory from youth, when those hands had kept an entire battalion safe across the cracked deserts of New Mexico and the burning sandstorms of Iraq. He kept his hand on the tank's armor longer than necessary, as if listening to something only he could hear. His breathing was slow and steady, each rhythm matching the way he had always inspected machines, slow enough not to miss anything, steady enough not to lose himself. Inside the vast hangar, the only sound was the rotating fan overhead, its distant hum pulling the past closer, close enough to touch. That sound carried Ward back to another wide, cold room in 1983, when an unexpected explosion shook the entire engine testing chamber. A moment too fast to react to, yet too slow to ever forget. He remembered the hiss of metal slicing through the air, the shard that tore into his right leg, and afterward the voices calling his name, not in gratitude, but to assign blame. Williams, the escorting officer, stood a few steps behind him, hesitant as though afraid to interrupt a silent ritual. His voice dropped to a whisper, as if worried his words would shatter the tension hanging in the room. "Sir, are you all right?" Ward didn't look over. He simply nodded once his eyes locked onto the exposed engine before him, like a body laid open on an operating table. He had watched too many machines die under hands that didn't understand them, and too many people point fingers at him when they couldn't find an answer. He no longer needed to explain anything. All he needed to do was look, and the Abrams spoke to him more in 1 minute than those young engineers had heard in a week. His shadow stretched long across the polished concrete floor, forming a heavy gray streak behind him. It looked like the silhouette of a man who once worked alongside 10-ton tanks with his bare hands, repairing them on dusty red roads, while entire units waited in breathless silence. But years later, technology had surpassed everything he once served. The world moved on to digital systems, simulations, sensors, automatic diagnostics. And he, the man who listened to engine vibrations the way others listened to heartbeats, was left outside the door of modernity with no one looking back. No one else in the hangar said a word. The silence stretched so long, it felt as if no one dared breathe. Ward stood there, steady and still like a stone carrying the weight of the afternoon on its shoulders. He didn't open his toolbox, didn't touch a single component. He just watched. His eyes once dulled by exhaustion, and time slowly lit up again with that familiar brightness, the kind only someone who understood these machines more than the so-called experts ever could possess. Old memories returned piece by piece. The glare of fluorescent lights, the smell of oil, the clink of steel on steel, the laughter of his fellow soldiers when the engine roared back to life after he tuned it. His wife's persistent question, "When will you ever make it home in time for dinner?" And finally the cold, clipped voices of the officers in the hearing room after the accident, emotionless, sharp ending, with the one sentence he could never forget. "We can't continue to keep you." Ward drew in a deeper breath, as though pulling back everything that had slipped from his hands long ago. His quietness wasn't weakness. It was the dignity of a man who had been left behind, yet rose each day with an old toolbox and kept going. And in that exact moment, a faint snicker rose from the group of engineers behind him, cutting through the silence like a blade slashing across the rare stillness he so rarely allowed himself. "Hey, Grandpa, maybe start with a lawnmower first." The words shot out like an arrow deliberately fired hard enough for the whole hangar to hear. The laughter that followed was sharp and brief, without a hint of respect, like pieces of metal clashing before dropping onto the cold concrete floor. It rang out and faded quickly, but the contempt it carried lingered far longer than the speaker expected. Ward stayed completely still, his back slightly bent with age, his hand resting near the edge of the engine, as if he hadn't heard anything. But he heard everything. Those sounds could never slip past the ears of someone who had lived through jet blasts, the grinding of tank tracks on rock, and explosions loud enough to alter an entire life. He didn't turn around, didn't respond. He simply held his silence as if to remind them that sometimes silence is the only armor a person has left. His eyes drifted over a bottle of oil on the shelf, the grease-stained rag hanging beside the cabinet, then the cold metallic gleam of the engine shaft. Small, ordinary objects to most people, but to Ward, they were gateways pulling him back to the moment when his life veered off its course completely. He remembered the testing chamber in 1982, the heat rising from the floor, like the ground itself was breathing. His teammates standing beside him, right before the explosion, tore apart the air. One man fell in front of him. A metal fragment shot through the wall and slammed into his leg, dropping him instantly. And after everything, the only words he heard were not, "Are you all right?" but "Your fault, Sergeant Ward." That memory had never left him. It lived inside every scar, inside every limping step he took each morning, inside the way he looked at young men who believed that degrees and new technology could tell them everything. They had no idea that some lessons could never come from machines, only from time and loss. A young engineer stepped forward, irritation clear on his face when he saw Ward holding his mechanical stethoscope. He snatched it from Ward's hand and said sharply, "You're working with hybrid stealth tech. You're out of your depth." The contempt in his voice was like a cold blade. Ward froze for exactly 1 second. Just one. Then he bent down, picked up the tool tossed to the ground. His eyes were sunken with age, but in their depths was something sharper than any piece of steel, the resolve of a man who had once repaired things far more complex than anything these kids had ever laid hands on. He wasn't angry, didn't argue, didn't try to prove himself. Ward knew exactly where he stood, and he knew exactly how they saw him, an outdated relic with no value. But he also understood something they had not yet learned when a machine is dying. It doesn't need degrees or ego. It needs someone who knows how to listen. Ward exhaled slowly. Then he quietly reached up and adjusted his cap, a small gesture he had done thousands of times during his service. The simple motion was like a silent reminder that no matter how lightly others took him, the values that had kept him standing through war were still in him untouched. Laughter broke out behind him again this time, with a more polished cruelty, as if they enjoyed the scene they had created. They thought they understood the Abrams. They thought they understood technology. But what they failed to grasp was this: some sounds can only be heard by those who have paid for that knowledge with blood. Ward lifted his head at the exact moment the light at the hangar entrance shifted. No one else noticed. But he did. It was the light that follows someone with authority, an aura that makes young men straighten their backs and forces the air itself to tighten. And then, from the far end, the heavy, decisive footsteps of General Archer moved toward them, cutting through the chaos the young engineers had used to hide their own ignorance. The silence inside the hangar suddenly grew heavier when a deep, firm voice rose behind the group of engineers. "Step aside." Just 2 words, yet enough to make everyone stiffen, as though pulled upright by an invisible cord. No one needed to turn around to know whose voice it was. When they did, the first thing that struck their eyes was the 4-star insignia gleaming on the perfectly pressed uniform of General Archer. The overhead lights reflected off his rank, casting a sharp glow that made every trace of arrogance from moments earlier shrink into insignificance. Archer didn't say anything more. He simply stood there, his stern gaze sweeping across each young face now standing ramrod straight. Then his eyes stopped, held with a gravity none of the younger men could decipher on Elias Ward, who was still leaning slightly over the dead Abrams. It was the look of someone who recognized a name these young men could not fathom. A name passed around the military like a ghost story never written in any official report, the ghost of Engine Test 14. A legend whispered more often than it was documented. Ward did not look up immediately. He opened the engine panel, his hands moving slowly, almost tenderly, as if handling something more familiar than even his own reflection. When the metal beneath was revealed, he placed his hand on the thermal mount right on the spot where many years ago he had poured into it not only his knowledge, but the heart of a soldier who once believed he was helping build something greater than his own life. Archer stepped closer, tilting his head to examine the exact part Ward had touched. Beneath layers of oil and time-worn dust was a small engraving, almost sanded down by decades, yet still recognizable W83. A marking none of the young engineers had ever noticed, but Archer knew. He knew exactly what it was. And more importantly, he knew exactly who had left it there. It felt as if the entire room had been drained of air. Young eyes darted between each other, and then back to Ward, filled with confusion and disbelief, seeing something they had never imagined could be real. One of them blurted out, voice trembling, "Sir." He designed that part. It wasn't a question. It was shock, the kind that arrives when arrogance finally collides with a truth it never knew existed. Ward withdrew his hand from the metal, his expression unchanged. No pride, no resentment. Only the quiet acceptance of a man long accustomed to seeing his worth engraved in steel rather than recognized in praise. Archer looked at Ward as if seeing a piece of history he had assumed was buried under decades of documents, reports, and generations of engineers who came and went. Ward's presence here at this exact moment felt like a reminder that some things age but never expire, and some people remain even when the world has forgotten to look for them. No one in the hangar dared breathe louder than necessary. No one dared laugh. Even the footsteps, the breaths, the rhythmic hum of the overhead fans seemed to slow down, giving space for the truth rising softly from beneath the layers of oil and metal. And in that thick, heavy silence, Archer tilted his head slightly toward Ward, as if preparing to speak a truth no one else in the room was worthy of hearing. General Archer stepped toward Ward, his polished boots stopping just half a step from the old veteran. He didn't look at the engine. He didn't look at the engineers. He looked directly at the man who had stood quietly through insults he never deserved. And then he spoke slowly, heavily. "Mr. Ward, or should I say Sergeant Ward, I owe you an apology." The words dropped into the hangar like a heavy stone, sending a ripple through every corner of the room. The young engineers who only moments ago carried discomfort on their faces straightened their backs instantly, their expressions shifting into a seriousness they never imagined they would hold for a man they had mocked just minutes earlier. Silence spread across the hangar this time, not the silence of disdain, but of realization. Ward didn't look back at Archer. His eyes stayed fixed on the engine plate, the reflection of the overhead light glinting off the metal, as if he were staring at a piece of his life that had been cut away. His voice came out rough, aged, not only by time, but by decades of forced quiet. "You don't owe me anything, sir." A simple sentence, but carrying the weight of a man who had been forgotten. Archer didn't look away. "You identified a failure that defeated 5 specialists for an entire week," he said, his voice no longer formal, but lower, truer. "And you did it in 20 minutes, with nothing but your ears." The words made even those standing far across the hangar swallow hard. Not because Archer was praising him, but because he spoke aloud the truth they all witnessed, yet didn't have the courage to admit there are things no diploma can teach. Things only experience, pain, and loyalty can impart. A long, deep stillness spread through the hangar. Ward remained as he was claiming no credit, showing no pride. But the young engineers looked at him differently now. They no longer saw a limping old man. No longer saw someone holding outdated tools from their father's generation. They saw someone who had once kept an entire program alive with scarred hands. Someone who made engines run when the battlefield couldn't afford them to fail. Someone who carried the weight of a failure no one had ever paused to ask if he deserved. Archer shifted slightly, placing his hand on the metal piece engraved with W83. His voice softened, but gained an unshakable firmness. "Not everyone has the courage to return to the place that hurt them the most." Ward closed his eyes for a single moment, as if that sentence touched a part of him he had locked away long ago. For him, recognition didn't lie in praise, it lay in the rare feeling that someone finally understood what had been taken from him. The group of young engineers behind them stood frozen, trying not to breathe too loudly, but the discomfort on their faces was unmistakable. They realized they had misjudged him from the very beginning. And sometimes, looking at oneself honestly is harder than fixing a dying engine. Archer lowered his voice, further speaking as if only to Ward, though everyone heard it clearly. I know what happened. And I know it took far more from you than just a career. Ward didn't answer. He only exhaled slowly, each breath sounding like he was setting down a burden he had carried alone for 40 years. No one in the room dared breathe louder than necessary. No one dared interrupt. The silence wasn't contempt anymore. It was respect slowly forming, quietly admitting itself, wrapping around the man standing before them. And just as the air settled so still that one could almost hear the heartbeat of every person in the room, Archer tilted his head slightly, preparing to uncover a truth that had remained buried for 4 long decades. General Archer drew in a slow breath before speaking, as though he too needed a moment to prepare himself to bring forth something buried for 40 years. That hybrid engine, he said, his eyes never leaving Ward, the one we're using today, still runs on the principles you wrote before the accident. Those words were not simply an admission. They were like a hand reaching out to open a door that had been locked for decades, a door Ward had stood outside of looking in, never daring to touch. Ward tightened the oil-stained rag in his hand, not forcefully, but just enough for the wrinkles on his skin to rise like the veins of an old tree that had weathered every season of storm. He stood motionless, but deep in his eyes was a quiet earthquake. What Archer had just said was not something he had been waiting for, but it was something he had hoped for long ago before he finally forced himself to let go in order to continue living without bitterness. Archer continued, his voice lower, slower, as if placing each word exactly where it belonged. Your work built the backbone of this machine, he said. The Army may have forgotten, but the metal never did. Those words touched a part of Ward's memory he had sealed off not out of anger, but out of the pain of someone who gave everything and was swept aside like a redundant technical error. Williams, the young officer who had followed Ward all morning, stood so still it was as if even his breath grew faint. He looked at Ward with entirely different eyes, not curiosity, not doubt, but respect. Respect for a man he did not know whether to call sir or teacher to an entire generation of military technicians. Carson, the engineer who had mocked Ward first, bowed his head deeply. No one told him to do it. No one forced him. But he did it because of the truth standing before him, a truth he realized he had been blind to. A man he once labeled outdated was in fact the foundation of the very technology he took pride in mastering. Ward looked at the Abrams in front of him. The engine had just been started again. No more shaking. No more misaligned rhythm. No more strained growl of a system refusing to synchronize with itself. The tank stood there like a creature that had finally regained its breath, each smooth cycle running like a belated apology from the past. And in that moment, Ward looked at it the way a father looks at a child he thought he had lost, finding its way home again. He said nothing. No one in the hangar said anything. But this silence carried a different weight. It no longer carried the breath of mockery or doubt. It was the silence of respect, of recognition, of the realization that some people build legacies no one remembers yet. When the truth emerges, everyone must bow to such endurance. Archer watched Ward for a long moment, as if he wanted to speak further, but understood that some truths become complete only when left unspoken. Ward drew a deep breath, then gently folded the rag and placed it back into his pocket, a small gesture, but for him it was like closing a chapter that had never been read properly. And just as everything seemed to settle, Carson stepped out of line and walked toward the man he once dismissed, carrying with him the words he now knew he had to say, even if they came 40 years late. Carson walked slowly toward Ward, the confidence that usually defined his expression now replaced by an unmistakable awkwardness. Standing in front of the older man, his voice caught as if each word struggled to leave his throat. Sir. Carson began swallowing hard. I judged you. I was wrong. You heard something none of us could hear. And you taught me something I should have learned years ago. Those words were spoken softly, but in the heavy stillness of the hangar, they seemed to echo farther than even the roar of the jet engines outside. Ward remained where he was, his hands still stained with grease, as though he had just handled a complicated piece of his own life. He didn't speak. He simply pulled the old rag from his pocket and wiped his hands gently. A small gesture, but for Ward it was how he steadied himself whenever faced with something he never thought he would hear again. Then he looked at Carson, no anger, no accusation. Only the calm acknowledgement of a man who had weathered far more storms than the younger generation could imagine. Machines do speak, son. Ward said, his voice low, thin, but steady enough to touch everyone in the room. They just speak to those who are willing to listen. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Carson froze. Not because the veteran had said something grand, but because the gentleness of it made him understand that Ward had never needed recognition. All he needed was to know that someone out there still wanted to listen to the knowledge he had spent a lifetime earning. Carson bowed his head deeply. Not to age, but to dignity. A bow that even the young engineers behind him fell silent, for realizing their pride could not stand next to the quiet steadiness of this man. Ward didn't turn away or step back. He simply straightened a little, as if that bow had returned to him a small part of what he had once lost. The atmosphere in the hangar felt entirely different now. The tension from mocking glances was gone. The snickers had vanished. Instead, there was a silence filled with respect the kind one holds when standing before something too true, too valuable to disturb with careless words. Carson drew another breath and steadied his voice. "If I could start over," he said, "I would never dare look at you the way I did." Ward gave a very small smile, barely enough to be seen, yet enough to say he understood. There was no need for more apologies. He was old enough to know that forgiveness at his age wasn't something he gave. It was something that had become part of who he was after losing too much. Ward glanced at Carson, then at the Abrams now standing solid, as if it had never faltered. The engine purred so softly, it sounded as though it were breathing, and Ward's gaze softened. In that moment, man and machine seemed to regain a balance both had lost for far too long. Carson stepped back, but his eyes stayed fixed on Ward, as if trying to memorize every detail of this encounter, one he knew would follow him for years, reminding him that humility is the lantern guiding any profession that carries the responsibility for someone else's life. Ward took a deep breath, then slowly folded the old rag and slipped it back into his pocket, as though closing a chapter he never thought he would hear again. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt a moment so quietly sad, yet quietly warm, that anyone present could only stand still and feel it. And then, as Carson left the hangar to go where he knew one last word still waited to be spoken, Ward remained standing there between dust and light, like a silent monument to a kind of worth the world had once forgotten. The next morning, with the sun still hanging low behind the red hills, Carson's black SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road, leading to the small farm where Ward had lived alone for years. Dust broke apart under the tires and rose into the air like traces of something old being awakened. Carson stepped out of the vehicle and saw Ward bent over an old tractor, his familiar hands still deep in grease as if nothing had happened the day before. The early sunlight fell across the old set of tools beside him, the dull steel glinting like a metal that needed no ceremony, one forged not by pomp, but by Ward's endurance itself. Carson paused for a few seconds, taking a long breath, before walking closer. He knew that what he was about to say was not the voice of an engineer, but the voice of someone who had learned a lesson far more important than anything taught in a university classroom. "Your worth was never lost, sir," Carson said, his voice steady yet heavy with regret. "It's just that we were too blind to see it." Ward lifted his head eyes deep and tired, but carrying a quiet light, the calm of someone who had accepted both pain and restoration. He didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded softly, as if to say he had already heard, already understood, and already forgiven long before the apology was spoken. Meanwhile, back at the base, the Abrams was being prepared for its afternoon demonstration. The hybrid engine that had tormented the entire team for a week now ran perfectly, no vibration, no misalignment, no strained growl, almost as if it were proud to finally raise its voice the way it had always been meant to. Inside the cockpit, on one of the steel braces, a young engineer who had witnessed every moment of the previous day engraved 3 words he knew he would never forget for Ward. Then he added with a thin yet unwavering stroke, "The man who heard what we could not hear." Those words would stay hidden in the shadow of the cockpit, unread each day, unannounced to the world, but they would live there as a quiet tribute to the man who accomplished what 5 trained specialists could not. A small mark, never loud, yet destined to remain with that Abrams until the day it ceased to run. Ward continued repairing the tractor before him, his hands moving slowly but precisely, as if yesterday's events were just another chapter in a book already thick with life. He had never asked to be acknowledged, never demanded repayment. The only thing he ever did was listen to machines, the language he had understood since he was a boy in an orphanage, taking things apart just to see how they worked. A light breeze swept across the farm, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. But something else as well, something farther away. Ward paused, listening. In that brief stillness, he heard the sound of the Abrams engine echoing from the distance, smooth, deep, steady. Not the sound of machinery, but the sound of a piece of his past sending him a greeting. A late greeting, but warm enough to stir his chest. Carson looked at him, eyes filled with respect and gratitude. Then he stepped back, opened the car door, yet turned once more toward the old man, bent over his tractor, as if trying to carve that image into memory. And as the SUV rolled away down the dirt road, Ward remained standing in the dusty field, a humble silhouette of a legacy that for years had gone unnamed, yet had never once disappeared. Stories of brave veterans, may we always remember these quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, click like, share this video, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so none of their memories are ever forgotten.